I'll never forget the sound of my cousins arguing over my grandmother's china set while her body was still warm in the hospital bed down the hall. The beeping of the heart monitor had just stopped 20 minutes earlier, and there they were, my Aunt Patricia, my Uncle Robert, and my cousins Jake and Madison, already making lists on their phones about who would get what from Grandma Rose's house. I stood frozen in that sterile hospital corridor, watching my own family transform into strangers, their grief apparently secondary to their greed. The fluorescent lights above us hummed with an electric coldness that seemed to match the chill that had settled over what was left of our family bonds. Patricia was already on the phone with some estate lawyer, her voice sharp and businesslike as she discussed asset evaluation and property division while my grandmother's hand was still holding the warmth of life. I felt sick to my stomach, not just from the antiseptic smell of the hospital, but from the realization that this was who we really were when the facade of family love was stripped away. Let me take you back to understand how we got to this moment, because this story doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with 32 years of me being treated like the family disappointment. Growing up, I was always the sensitive one, the emotional one, the one who cried too easily and cared too much about everyone else's feelings. My grandmother Rose was the only person who ever saw value in those qualities, the only one who never made me feel like my empathy was a weakness. While my cousins were pursuing their practical careers, Jake in finance, Madison in marketing, both of them inheriting the family's ruthless business sense, I became a social worker, much to everyone's horror. At every family gathering, I had to endure the same conversations about how I was wasting my potential and how I'd never amount to anything helping poor people. Uncle Robert would always shake his head and mutter something about how I'd end up broke and alone, while Aunt Patricia would make passive-aggressive comments about how some people choose to struggle. The only person who ever defended me was Grandma Rose, and even she couldn't shield me from the constant barrage of criticism that came with every Christmas dinner, every birthday party, every funeral we attended together. Grandma Rose lived in the same Victorian house on Maple Street where she'd raised her children, a beautiful 3-story home with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that had been the setting for countless family memories. The house was worth easily $600,000 in today's market, sitting pretty in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in town, surrounded by oak trees that had been planted when the house was first built in 1924. For years, I'd watched my relatives circle that house like vultures, making comments about what they'd do when the time came, how they'd renovate this or sell that, how the property taxes were such a waste for one old woman living alone. Patricia had been particularly vocal about how Grandma should move to a retirement community and let the family make better use of such valuable real estate. Every holiday gathering became an opportunity for them to plant seeds about the future, to remind Grandma that she was getting older, that maintaining such a big house was too much work for someone her age. I hated those conversations, hated how they made Grandma's eyes dim with sadness, hated how they treated her like she was already dead and just taking up space in their inheritance plans. But Grandma Rose was sharper than any of them gave her credit for, and she saw right through their transparent greed. She'd lived through the Great Depression, raised 4 children as a single mother after my grandfather died in Vietnam, and built a successful catering business from nothing but determination and her grandmother's recipe book. She wasn't the frail, confused old woman they liked to pretend she was when they were discussing her best interests. Behind those kind blue eyes was a steel backbone and a mind that had outwitted business competitors, difficult customers, and decades of people who underestimated her because she was a woman. She watched her children and grandchildren with the same careful attention she'd once used to manage her business, taking note of who visited her because they genuinely cared and who showed up only when they needed something. She saw how Patricia only called when she wanted money for Jake's college tuition or Madison's wedding expenses. She noticed how Robert only came around when his construction business was struggling and he needed a loan. And she definitely noticed how they all suddenly became very interested in her health and living situation once she hit her 80s. The real turning point came last Thanksgiving, when what should have been a celebration of gratitude turned into the most disgusting display of greed I'd ever witnessed from people who were supposed to be family. We were all gathered in Grandma's dining room, the same room where she'd hosted decades of holiday meals, where the walls were covered with family photos spanning 4 generations. The turkey was perfectly golden, the stuffing made from her secret recipe that she'd never shared with anyone, and the table was set with her grandmother's china, the same china my cousins had been eyeing like prized possessions all evening. Everything seemed normal until Patricia started talking about practical matters and how we all needed to face reality about Grandma's situation. She launched into this speech about how the house was becoming too much for Grandma to handle, how we all worried about her safety living alone, and how maybe it was time to explore other options. The temperature in that room dropped 20 degrees as we all realized this wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was an intervention designed to manipulate an 87-year-old woman into giving up her home. I watched my grandmother's face change as Patricia kept talking, her voice taking on that fake concerned tone that I'd heard her use with difficult clients at her real estate office. Robert joined in with statistics about elderly people falling in their homes, about the burden of property maintenance, about how much money Grandma could have if she downsized to a nice little apartment somewhere. Jake and Madison nodded along like bobblehead dolls, occasionally chiming in with their own rehearsed concerns about Grandma's quality of life and peace of mind. But I could see what they were really doing. This was a coordinated attack designed to wear down an elderly woman's resistance until she agreed to hand over the keys to her kingdom. The worst part was watching Grandma's shoulders slump slightly as the weight of their manipulation settled on her, seeing the hurt in her eyes as she realized that her own family was treating her like an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be cherished. That's when something inside me snapped, and I realized I couldn't sit there silently anymore while they bulldozed over the woman who had been the only source of unconditional love in my entire life. The months following that Thanksgiving dinner revealed the true depths of my family's manipulation, and I watched in horror as they systematically began their campaign to wear down my grandmother's resistance. Patricia started showing up unannounced with real estate brochures for luxury senior living communities, spreading them across Grandma's kitchen table like she was planning a vacation instead of plotting to uproot an 87-year-old woman from the only home she'd known for 60 years. She'd bring Jake along for these visits, and he'd launch into these elaborate financial presentations about maximizing assets and smart investment strategies, treating my grandmother like she was a client in his banking office rather than the woman who had helped pay for his business degree. The most sickening part was how they'd frame everything as concern for her well-being, using phrases like, "We just want what's best for you," and "We're only thinking about your safety," while their eyes practically sparkled with dollar signs. I started dropping by more often during these visits, and I could see how exhausted Grandma was getting from constantly having to defend her right to live in her own home. Robert took a different approach, focusing on the practical problems of maintaining such an old house, suddenly becoming very interested in every creaky floorboard and drafty window that he'd ignored for decades. He'd walk through the house with a clipboard, making notes about necessary repairs and safety hazards, creating this extensive list of renovations that would supposedly cost tens of thousands of dollars. Then he'd sit Grandma down with his contractor's calculator and show her these inflated estimates for new roofing, updated electrical work, and modern plumbing, painting a picture of financial doom if she didn't act quickly. What made it even more disgusting was that Robert had been in construction for 30 years. He could have helped maintain the house all along if he'd actually cared about his mother's comfort rather than his future inheritance. Instead, he'd let minor issues turn into bigger problems so he could use them as ammunition in his campaign to force her out. He'd shake his head dramatically and say things like, "Mom, you can't afford to keep throwing money into this money pit," conveniently forgetting that he'd been borrowing money from that same money pit to keep his business afloat for the past 5 years. Madison and Jake had their own roles in this orchestrated manipulation, playing the part of the concerned grandchildren who just wanted their beloved grandmother to be safe and happy. Madison would bring her 2 young children over for visits, then spend the entire time pointing out how dangerous various aspects of the house were for kids: the steep stairs, the old radiators, the uneven front porch steps that had been perfectly fine for decades of family gatherings. She'd make comments about how worried she was about Grandma falling, how the house was too isolated for someone her age. How wouldn't it be so much better if Grandma lived somewhere with professional care available? Jake focused on the financial angle, constantly bringing up stories about elderly people being taken advantage of by contractors and repair services, painting a picture of Grandma as a vulnerable target who needed to liquidate her assets before she was somehow cheated out of them. He'd wave around articles about estate planning and protecting your legacy, making it sound like selling the house was the only way to ensure that her grandchildren would actually inherit anything worthwhile. What broke my heart most was watching how these constant attacks were affecting my grandmother's confidence and sense of self-worth. This was a woman who had run a successful business for 40 years, who had navigated the male-dominated world of commercial catering in the 1960s and 70s, who had raised 4 children while building a financial empire from nothing but determination and hard work. But after months of having her own family treat her like she was incompetent and burdensome, I could see her starting to doubt herself. She'd call me sometimes in the evening, her voice shaky with uncertainty, asking if maybe they were right about the house being too much for her to handle. She'd wonder aloud if she was being selfish by holding onto a property that could provide financial security for her children and grandchildren, if maybe she really was too old to make good decisions about her own life. Those phone calls were like daggers to my heart because I could hear how their manipulation was working, how they were slowly convincing this brilliant, capable woman that she was nothing more than a foolish old lady who needed to be managed by people who supposedly knew better. The breaking point came in early March when Patricia announced that she'd arranged for a professional assessment of Grandma's living situation without even asking for permission. She showed up with some woman from a senior living consulting service, introduced her as someone who specialized in helping families navigate difficult transitions, and basically conducted an interrogation disguised as a friendly chat. This consultant walked through the house with a checklist, making notes about everything from the height of the bathroom fixtures to the accessibility of the kitchen cabinets, treating my grandmother's beloved home like it was a problem to be solved rather than a lifetime of memories to be respected. She asked invasive questions about Grandma's daily routines, her medical history, her social connections, and her financial resources, all while Patricia hovered nearby nodding encouragingly and adding her own commentary about her concerns. The whole thing was a setup designed to create an official-looking report that would support their narrative about Grandma being unable to live independently. And I watched my grandmother shrink smaller and smaller as this stranger evaluated her life like she was a specimen under a microscope. That night, after Patricia and her consultant had left, I found my grandmother sitting in her living room crying quietly in the dark, surrounded by the furniture and photographs that represented 8 decades of a life well lived. She looked so small and defeated, clutching a tissue in her weathered hands while she stared at the family photos covering her mantel, pictures of children and grandchildren who were now treating her like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a person to be honored. She told me she was starting to think maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was being stubborn and foolish for wanting to stay in her own home. Maybe she should just sign the papers and move somewhere more appropriate for someone her age. The defeat in her voice was devastating because I knew this wasn't what she really wanted. This was what months of psychological manipulation had convinced her she should want. As I sat there holding her hand in the darkness of her living room, surrounded by the echoes of all the family gatherings and holiday celebrations that had filled this house with love and laughter, I realized that I couldn't stand by and watch them destroy her anymore. I had to do something to protect the woman who had been my anchor in a family that had never valued anything I had to offer, but I had no idea yet just how powerful the weapon I was about to wield would prove to be. The moment I decided to fight back came on a rainy Tuesday in April, when I walked into Grandma's house and found her sitting at her kitchen table with a stack of brochures for assisted living facilities. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she studied floor plans for tiny apartments that would barely fit her bedroom furniture. Patricia had left the brochures with highlighted sections showing amenities like communal dining rooms and scheduled activities, as if my independent, vibrant grandmother was supposed to be excited about having her meals planned for her and her social life organized by recreational directors. The sight of her trying to imagine her life squeezed into a sterile one-bedroom unit, surrounded by strangers, instead of the memories she'd built over 60 years, filled me with a rage I'd never experienced before. I sat down across from her at that same kitchen table where she'd taught me to bake cookies when I was 7, where she'd helped me with homework throughout high school, where she'd listened to me cry about every heartbreak and disappointment of my adult life. And I made a decision that would change everything. I took her hands in mine and looked directly into those tired blue eyes that had seen too much manipulation over the past few months, and I told her something I'd been keeping secret for over 2 years. I explained that my work as a social worker had evolved far beyond what anyone in our family realized. That I'd been promoted to director of a major nonprofit organization that managed elder care advocacy and legal protection services across 3 states. What I hadn't told anyone, what I'd kept private because I was tired of their condescending attitudes about my little helping job, was that my organization had recently received a $15 million federal grant to expand our services, and that I was now overseeing a team of attorneys, social workers, and financial advisors who specialized in protecting elderly people from exactly the kind of manipulation my family was putting her through. The shock on her face was immediate and profound, not because she was surprised I was capable of such success, but because she realized I had the professional knowledge and legal resources to understand exactly what Patricia, Robert, and my cousins were doing to her. I spent the next hour explaining to her the tactics I'd seen countless families use against elderly relatives, the psychological manipulation techniques that were textbook examples of financial elder abuse, and how everything my family had been doing followed a predictable pattern that my organization dealt with every single day. I showed her how Patricia's concern visits were actually pressure campaigns designed to isolate her from her support system and undermine her confidence in her own decision-making abilities. I explained how Robert's inflated repair estimates were a classic manipulation tactic, creating artificial urgency around financial problems that could easily be solved without selling her home. I detailed how Madison and Jake's safety concerns were scripted talking points used to make elderly people feel like they were endangering themselves and others by maintaining their independence. Most importantly, I assured her that none of their behavior was motivated by genuine love or concern. It was a calculated campaign to gain control of her most valuable asset, and everything they were doing could be legally challenged if necessary. The transformation in my grandmother's demeanor was remarkable and immediate, like watching someone emerge from a fog that had been clouding their judgment for months. She sat up straighter in her chair, Her voice became stronger and more decisive, and for the first time since Thanksgiving, I saw flashes of the fierce, determined woman who had built a business empire and raised a family through sheer force of will. She told me she'd known something felt wrong about the way everyone was pressuring her, but she'd started to doubt her own instincts because they all seemed so united in their concern for her well-being. She admitted that she'd been feeling guilty for wanting to stay in her own home, like she was being selfish by not considering what would be easier for everyone else. But now, armed with the knowledge that their behavior was actually a form of abuse that my organization fought against every day, she was ready to stop being a victim and start being the formidable woman she'd always been. We spent the rest of that afternoon developing a strategy that would not only protect her from further manipulation, but would also send a clear message to my family about the consequences of treating an elderly person like a commodity to be liquidated. I helped her contact her longtime attorney to review and update her will, ensuring that her wishes would be legally protected regardless of any pressure tactics they might escalate to in the future. We documented every instance of manipulation and pressure she could remember, creating a timeline that showed the systematic nature of their campaign against her independence. Most importantly, I connected her with the legal advocacy team from my organization, pro bono services that would monitor any future attempts to coerce or manipulate her into decisions that weren't in her best interests. By the time I left that evening, my grandmother was no longer the confused, pressured victim they'd been working so hard to create. She was a woman with professional legal protection and a granddaughter who had the expertise and resources to fight back against anyone who tried to exploit her. The first test of our new dynamic came just 2 days later, when Patricia showed up unannounced with another real estate agent, this time someone who specialized in estate liquidation services for elderly clients. She waltzed into Grandma's house with her usual fake smile and introduced this pushy woman who immediately started taking measurements and making notes about market potential and staging recommendations, treating my grandmother like she wasn't even present in her own living room. But instead of the tired, overwhelmed woman they'd been dealing with for months, they encountered a confident, well-informed homeowner who politely but firmly asked them to leave until they were invited back for a proper appointment. Patricia's shock was visible and immediate. She'd expected to find the same beaten-down woman she'd been systematically wearing away, not someone who suddenly seemed to have found her backbone and was setting clear boundaries about her own property. The real estate agent left quickly, sensing the shift in power dynamics, but Patricia lingered, clearly confused and frustrated by this unexpected resistance to what had been such a successful manipulation campaign. The final confrontation happened at what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner in late June, but turned into the most explosive showdown our family had ever experienced. Patricia had orchestrated what she called a family meeting at Grandma's house, bringing Robert, Jake, and Madison along with a briefcase full of legal documents that she claimed would simplify everything and make the transition easier for everyone. They arrived with the confidence of people who believed they'd already won, settling into Grandma's dining room like they owned the place, spreading their papers across her mahogany table while discussing next steps and timeline considerations, as if she wasn't sitting right there listening to them plan her future without her input. I watched from my spot next to Grandma as they laid out their master plan. They'd found a lovely assisted living facility just 20 minutes away. They'd arranged for an estate sale company to handle disposing of unnecessary items, and they'd even contacted a realtor who could have the house on the market within a month. The casual cruelty of their language, referring to 60 years of cherished possessions as unnecessary items and talking about disposing of my grandmother's lifetime of memories, made my blood boil with righteous fury. Patricia pulled out a power of attorney document that she'd apparently had prepared by her lawyer, sliding it across the table toward Grandma with the kind of smile that sharks probably wear when they smell blood in the water. She explained in her most condescending voice how this would protect Grandma from having to worry about complicated financial decisions and would allow the family to handle everything efficiently so she could just focus on enjoying her golden years. The document would give Patricia complete control over Grandma's finances, property, and legal affairs, essentially making my grandmother a prisoner in her own life while they liquidated everything she'd worked for and built over 8 decades. Robert chimed in with his usual fear-mongering about the dangers of elderly people trying to manage their own affairs, painting horrifying pictures of financial scams and predatory contractors that would supposedly target her if she didn't sign away her independence immediately. Jake and Madison nodded along enthusiastically, adding their own rehearsed comments about how relieved they'd be to know that Grandma was safe and taken care of by people who understood these complicated matters. That's when my grandmother looked at me with a slight smile and said, "Well, I think it's time to tell everyone about the conversation I had with my lawyer yesterday." The room fell silent as she explained that she'd spent 2 hours reviewing her will and estate planning with her attorney, making some important updates that reflected her current wishes and circumstances. She told them about the legal advocacy services she'd arranged through my nonprofit organization, services that would monitor and investigate any attempts to coerce or manipulate her into financial decisions that weren't in her best interests. The temperature in that room dropped about 30 degrees as they began to realize that their carefully planned manipulation campaign had been discovered and documented by legal professionals who specialized in elder abuse cases. Patricia's face went white as Grandma casually mentioned that her attorney had been very interested in the unusual amount of pressure she'd been experiencing from family members regarding her living situation and financial assets. But the real bombshell came when Grandma reached into her own briefcase, the one none of them had noticed she'd brought to this family meeting, and pulled out a revised will that she'd signed just that morning. She explained that her original will had left the house, and the majority of her assets to be divided equally among her children and grandchildren. But that recent events had made her reconsider who truly deserved to inherit the fruits of her lifetime of hard work. The new will left the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, and the business assets entirely to me, with the explanation that I was the only family member who had shown genuine love and respect for her as a person rather than viewing her as a source of future wealth. She looked directly at Patricia and said, "I've decided to leave everything to the granddaughter who became successful by helping people instead of exploiting them, who visits me because she loves me instead of because she wants something from me, and who has shown me what real family loyalty looks like." The explosion that followed was like nothing I'd ever witnessed in my life. Patricia started screaming about undue influence and manipulation, hurling accusations that I had somehow coerced an elderly woman into changing her will, the same elderly woman they'd been systematically pressuring and manipulating for months. Robert jumped up from his chair and began ranting about family obligations and fairness, suddenly very concerned about equitable treatment after spending years treating me like the family failure who didn't deserve respect or consideration. Jake and Madison just sat there in stunned silence, watching their inheritance plans crumble while their parents melted down in ways that revealed their true characters more clearly than any holiday dinner conversation ever could. The irony was breathtaking. They were accusing me of the exact same manipulation tactics they'd been using against Grandma, except I had actually empowered her to make her own decisions while they had tried to take that power away from her. As the shouting continued and Patricia threatened to contest the will, my grandmother stood up with more dignity and strength than I'd seen from her in months, and delivered the final blow that ended their manipulation campaign forever. She told them that her attorney had advised her to document everything, and that she had detailed records of every pressure visit, every manipulative conversation, and every attempt to undermine her confidence and independence over the past 8 months. She explained that contesting the will would require them to prove that she was mentally incompetent to make financial decisions, which would be difficult to do when she had professional legal advocates who could testify about her mental acuity and her clear understanding of how she'd been manipulated. Most devastating of all, she informed them that any legal challenge to her would trigger a full investigation into their behavior, and that elder abuse charges could potentially be filed if the evidence supported a pattern of financial exploitation and psychological manipulation. The room fell completely silent as they realized that their greed had not only cost them their inheritance, but had also put them at risk of serious legal consequences. Looking back now, 6 months after that confrontation, I can see how perfectly everything worked out. Grandma is still living happily in her beautiful Victorian house, surrounded by her memories and her independence, with legal protections in place that ensure no one can ever manipulate her again. Patricia, Robert, Jake, and Madison have barely spoken to either of us since that day, but honestly, losing contact with people who only valued us for what they could get from us has been more of a relief than a loss. My grandmother and I have grown closer than ever, and she's become actively involved with my nonprofit organization, using her business expertise to help other elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse. She often tells people that losing her greedy children was a small price to pay for discovering which member of her family actually loved her unconditionally. And as for me, I finally learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is not keeping the peace, but having the courage to fight for what's right, even when it means standing up to your own family and revealing secrets that change everything forever.